Thank you. Well, thank you all. I have no doubt that at the end of this excellent experience that you're having, you all will in fact be giving us lessons on how to integrate stuff into our teaching. And I can already tell, I heard this yesterday, you are by far the liveliest group, making the most decibel noise that we've had on this hallway for quite some time, which is only a good thing. That is only a good thing. What we usually do is waste it on the young, so I appreciate the energy that has been assembled and momentarily contained here. So I have a little presentation to get you talking. If you remember nothing else about the Middle East and this topic of young people and millennials and youth, remember that these are young societies that are getting younger all the time. They're just getting younger and younger, faster and faster. And so that is the dynamic that should be in the back of your heads. And as educators, as people who spend a lot of time institutionalized with young people, you have an inbuilt sense of what that means, what that youthful energy sort of does to a place, an institution, how difficult it is to contain, how difficult it is to channel. And I heard you talking about some of that earlier. As far back as 2006, I regularly made enemies by saying things like the Israeli war on Gaza is statistically a war on children, because most of the population are in fact under the age of 18. And sadly, that horrible fact, that horrible line has come in handy in all the subsequent wars. They are all wars on children. The war in Iraq was a war on children. The war in Afghanistan is largely a war on children. The wars in Syria, Yemen, everywhere. These are conflicts that are statistically taking their toll on populations that are young and getting younger. And this perspective, again, for you as educators, it applies a little bit more perhaps than to our society as a whole. I want to use the United States as an example of an older society. So this image here, and I'll show you a bunch of these different images. This is a very one-dimensional way, kind of like the surveys that you were looking at, a one-dimensional way of looking at a particular society. So the blue represents males, the red represents females in our binary gender distribution here, and these subsectors represent different age groups and their percentage of the population. So this is the United States age pyramid for our population of some 330 million, and it's a fairly rectangular, rocket-shaped thing where you can, I'm gonna trip here, so, where you can just detect the last vestiges of the baby boom, even though they loom large in our cultural and political life. I don't know what this is down here going on. But when you looked at the US age pyramid in the past, you could definitely see the baby boom. But right now, it's a quite rectangular shape. But let me contrast that with a really old society, namely Italy. This is the Italian age pyramid for 2019. And this is what an aging society looks like, where you have a big bulge of old people supported by an ever narrower set of younger people, posing even starker versions of that issue of who is going to take care of all those old people, whose labor is going to fund the retirement of an aging population. So the United States looks sort of rectangular. Italy looks kind of diamond-shaped, as do lots of European and advanced East Asian countries. This, of course, is Egypt, and this is what you're going to see as a more typical age pyramid for most of the countries of the Middle East. okay? And this is the basic profile of a young society. Very few up on top, as in the others, but a widening base, okay? And some version of this is going to be what age profiles of Middle Eastern countries, not to mention other countries in the global south, tend to look like. So I'll show you a few of these. Sorry. So that's Egypt. Here's Israel, by contrast. It shares some of that sort of stable rectangularity of the United States model, because of course, although it is geographically a Middle Eastern country, it shares so many cultural aspects with the European West. And by contrast here, this is Syria, okay, where you can just begin to make out at the base here, interestingly, I think this is interesting, probably the effects of conflict, where in Syria, what I work on now, somewhere between 5, 6, 7 million people have fled the country. Half of the population of what used to be about 23 million are internally displaced. And interestingly, I didn't think you would be able to see it down here, but you can begin to see that reflected in the fact that anybody who can, for this period between 2012 and 2017, was desperate to leave. I'll show you a couple more. This is what the Palestinian pyramid looks like, okay? And again, you can contrast that with the Israeli pyramid from before. It means nothing in and of itself, but it's interesting to put a single kind of graphic image on the demographic fears that motivate right-wing policy in any country. In this case, it's a picture of what the Israeli right wing is afraid of, that this is all potential, this is all trouble, this is all something that either will be integrated or will not be integrated. And so you see in these very simple shapes graphic representations of what some of the issues are. Palestine is like other war-torn Middle Eastern countries. They all share that same basic profile. This could be Palestine, but it's also Iraq. Here is Yemen, slightly different shape, perhaps even, I don't know what that outer bulge at the bottom means exactly, but that there are even fewer old people at the top. Afghanistan and South Sudan, a catastrophic exercise in flawed sovereignty that is economically unviable, politically unviable. So it looks like the profile of countries that are chronically war-torn over time has this kind of, let's have lots of kids and hope for the best, okay? I want to contrast that with some Middle Eastern countries like Iran that have actually shown, what do you think this means down here? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, after the Islamic Republic, people started having small families.
Yeah, so there was, very active education, at least for certain periods in the 1990s and probably ongoing, in which the grooms are all taken into one room and taught how to use birth control, and the brides are all taken into another room giggling and taught how to use birth control because the state had an interest in having it that way. And it's preceded by a large bulge where, of course, when you're engaged in a war of attrition with your next door neighbor that is consuming people by the hundreds of thousands and indeed the millions, you're like, yeah, have more babies, make us more cannon fodder for the future. So you can see little aspects of history in these profiles. And the last one that was interesting, because I didn't know this would show up, this is the United Arab Emirates. And I'm like, what the heck? Which is, of course, who can articulate it? What is that big bump? Yeah, it's a bunch of men. And this is the effect of importing your entire labor force from the Indian subcontinent, right? That's what that is, okay? And you can also see, again, a well-resourced country, shows some signs of that pedestal where, yeah, you can have state programs, education programs to have people make choices about their reproductive future. That shows on the female side of this. But the other thing that's being done with this over-resourced system is the importation of millions and millions of non-reproductive male bodies, okay? So just an interesting way to look at this. Yes?
Does that represent citizens or residents?
No, the residents. That's what I thought, because if it represented citizens, you wouldn't have it, right? It's not that there is some massive selective abortion program going on as might show up in other very reproductively aggressive societies. This is what happens when you simply count the residents, and these are all working age men, most of them from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and then Egypt, Philippines, other places. Yeah.
So my question is, they're not bringing or creating families?
Well, that is the sinister efficiency of a system of hot and cold running imported labor. That again, and you see it reflected a little bit in all the Indonesian and Philippine women who come into this system as domestic workers and nannies. And what the way they function by and large is as economic extensions of their natal family or their natal village, as economic migrants do in this country as well. They come, they work, they send money back. That money forms an incredibly important part not only of their family's livelihood, raising their kids, sustaining their parents, but also circulating in their towns and cities and villages. And, along with the very tightly held control of citizenship, these people have no hope of being citizens, no rights, right, to speak of within these systems. Certainly not the right to get married, and they live in appalling conditions. They're subjected to 12-hour work days. They live in little dormitories in which people hot sheet and share beds in a barracks full of male workers, things like this. So yeah, so this is a very different and unique profile. Yeah.
Seeing this right after you were talking about the Arab Youth Survey, where so many people wanted to emulate the UAE, is really creepy.
Yes, yes. This is what pure material success based on a foundation of extractive fossil fuel looks like. And again, to go back to the financial crisis of 2008, one of the creepy kind of symbols of just what this meant in practical terms was when the financial crisis struck, and the UAE recovered very quickly from it. It was a momentary dip. But the parking lots at Dubai's world-class airport filled up with abandoned cars, okay? Because literally, think of it as a faucet for hot and cold running labor. When you want more workers, you allow more workers in through the complex system of patronage and visas. And when you want those workers out, you terminate their visas along with their financial incentives. And people just left their cars. Most of these workers don't have their own personal cars, but there are many, many other expats as well. There's a middle class as well. They just drove their cars to the airport, got on the next plane home, and left their cars in the parking lot. And that's kind of an indicator of the ugly side of what this looks like. It's great to be a citizen in these societies, and the citizens have great opportunities, including the women, within a patriarchal framework, of course. But, and there's plenty of money, there's plenty of consumer goods. I've recently been writing about the cosmetics industry in the Gulf. That is big, big business, especially in the UAE, which has taken, has been very kind of innovative in creating inviting investment markets and distribution systems for external capital to come in. So yeah, if you are among the chosen couple of 100,000 who have citizenship rights, yes, you are a little burdened by the tradition and the weight of that. But yeah, anything you want to buy, you can pretty much buy. And any lifestyle that you envision, you can certainly envision for free, although you might have a hard time enacting it in a tightly held little patriarchy, because all the work is being done by imported labor. So that's something to keep in mind. So this is just one way to look at a society. What does that shape mean? And again, people who study this say there are 4 distinctive shapes, some of which we've looked at, maybe all of which we've looked at here today, that can give you an idea about what society looks like in age terms at a glance. Okay? Of course, just like the surveys that you were complaining about, they are a ridiculously one-dimensional way of looking at a society. Okay? So everything about them is arbitrary, although they are useful. But imagine these societies as buzzing, swarming assemblages of people with a certain amount of energy devoted to extracting resources, competing with each other for resources, investing in territoriality, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't mean to present these societies in this 2-dimensional flat way, but it is instructive. And I'll go out on a limb here and I'll say it's as instructive as many of the other ways that we tend to look at society. We tend to, I'm an anthropologist and a historian, we tend to start with a notion of unique and different culture. That's one way to start. As I've wrestled with that concept over a long time now, I'm less and less enchanted with the concept of culture. We're basically all, one of the most misleading things about those diagrams, instructive about how we organize our world, but of course they're presented as discrete shapes that correspond to discrete countries, when in fact you might imagine them as lines of kind of power moving through, which are all connected with each other. You definitely connect more with the people on your particular graph in your particular society, right? You're mutually intelligible, you share the same space, you share lots of other aspects, et cetera, but all those are also wired into one another in all kinds of interesting ways, okay? So again, if you think of them as sort of these buzzing, humming multitudes of people moving through time, sharing certain aspects of space and communicative ability, all of these systems that we looked at, from the United States to Italy to Afghanistan, are running very similar operating systems, related operating systems, that start with some flavor of Abrahamic patriarchy and added to it very important components of nationalism and realpolitik, neoliberal capitalism. But the basic foundational elements are all the same. So one of the first things that you want to do, one of the hardest things to educate your students about is getting out of an us versus them Orientalist mindset, where, religion, culture is so different and it explains so much. And of course, we have a lazy-ass media that constantly recycles and reiterates that for what passes for analysis. And that is a huge swamp. And if you as an educator are able to cut your own personal way out of that thicket of us versus them. Ooh, scary Islam. We all know not to be Islamophobic. But it takes actual time and effort to reckon with the fact that, Italian patriarchy, American patriarchy, should be looked at with the same Abrahamic lens as what we look at in the Middle East. So I'm increasingly abandoning a notion of culture, which is, again, very interesting to think about the way the ratios of religion to what we think of as sort of liberal political culture or democratic kind of aspirations or ideologies or socialism or whatever make up any particular functioning node of culture. But think about it that way, because it's actually quite interesting when you sustain it for a while. So I've lost my connection here. Let me see. Yeah, this is what happens when I leave all my things online. I am dependent on that Wi-Fi connection. It'll come. So I just want to sort of start with that and try and explore a couple of implications, blah, 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 blah. See, so you can see what that looks like in real time. What does the shape mean? Imagine it thus. Okay. The first thing that comes to mind is the difference between an old society and a young society. And as I was sitting glued to my TV and my Twitter stream, as I periodically am when we, a rather old society, tiredly hash out and are constantly threatened with impotence and dealing with our issues. Somebody on my Twitter feed was like, it is incredible how much our society depends on old white guys in their 70s to do things. And that I thought was very insightful and not a joke. That is not a joke. It's like, oh, so much attention paid to Mueller's capacity as someone who is respectable and respected and able to take on this huge challenge, which perhaps in other younger societies might be dealt with in less, or might be less snarled up and tangled up in these sort of sclerotic proceedings. I'm not saying revolution or take to the streets or what have you, but in an old society, there are more people who are personally inclined to not take risks, to err on the side of caution, to err on the side of incrementalism, to negotiate and split hairs and do these kinds of things. And I've noticed this for a long time, because when I go to the Gulf countries, and I, of course, like to think of myself as a youthful post-adolescent, which is getting harder and harder to sustain every year. And when I go to, Middle Eastern countries and you're sort of, doing the delegations and the tours, you notice that all your peers, all the people you're being introduced to are like the age of your nieces and nephews, if not your children. And I'm like, whoa, we have captured so much of our society's kind of cultural capital among people who have waited their turn, and we're just going to do it, and we've lost a lot of our youthful enthusiasm by the time it's our turn to do it. And you go to, say, the UAE, and you're like, whoa, I'm sitting across the desk with some big poobah who is, very young, and he's not the only one, and they're all young, because that's what that dynamic looks like. And young societies, so I begin to think of this in terms of ratios. The amount of energy that's devoted to policy making, problem solving, getting things done, is that sitting with old graybeards? Or is it somehow devolving down, if only by gravity and physics, to people who are younger and who have had access to education outside, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing to consider. And at least we don't live in Italy, which I think is a really old society, but our society is quite old. Young societies have shorter half-lives. And forgive me for misusing and abusing STEM technology here. But the idea that the turnover happens much quicker. And again, we don't think of these things. We tend to think of societies as blobs whose essence is a certain tradition or culture. But some of our societies are like turtles, and we just live and kind of process the same material over, where other societies are like shedding off generations. You're like, oh, I've been gone for 2 years. Oh, there's a whole nother branch of the family I need to get to know. So that has some interesting implications as well. So even though we're inclined to think of societies of the Middle East as more traditional and therefore somehow more slowly, and again, this is all part of our Orientalist mindset that, time stands still, they move very slowly, we're super fast and we're doing everything, with, we're on top of every latest fad. Well, in fact, that is the opposite. Because you have new generations cropping up regularly with new skill sets, new problems, and very importantly, access to new technologies that they need to live with. The first texts that I ever saw being used, back in the early 2000s were in Syria. And I remember very well the first time I was introduced to texts. First of all, Syria was a society where you had to wait for basically 2 or 3 decades to get a landline. So as soon as a baby was born in the 1980s or the 1990s, their parents would run down to the Ministry of Communications to sign them up for a landline so that hopefully by the time they got married, they would have a phone in their apartment. Okay, so that was the sort of the state of things beforehand in a prior era. Of course, what this meant was that when cell phone technology hit a country like Syria, it expanded instantaneously. It was like one of those chemical reactions where it's like, poof, suddenly everybody has a cell phone. Everyone is competing to have the nicest, best cell phone, even in the days before smartphones. And although the crony capitalism of the authoritarian state made damn sure that all the profits from those cell phones were going into the coffers of the family of the dictator, nevertheless, there's a very vibrant access to all that technology, and it was accessible. So I remember the first time I ever saw a text. I was sitting with a family, and in that era, the men used to like to take out their cell phones and compare who had the fanciest, most modern cell phone. But the most interesting feature was sitting around at dinner and getting a ping, just a ping on one of the daughter's cell phones. And I was like, oh, what's that? And she's like, oh yeah, that's my married sister in Saudi Arabia. We're not going to spend the money to call, but she just sends me this little ping, this little text at dinner time, so we know, that she's thinking of us and that she misses us. And I was like, whoa, that is so cool. And it took me, another 12 years to become an avid texter myself. So that's just one small little anecdote about how these things are not always as they seem. So you look at a place like Saudi Arabia, which if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about. When I last looked, around 2013 or 2014, the single most active demographic sector in terms of hosting and producing blogs at that time, which I was interested in, was Saudi women, okay? They were compensating in some important way for their lack of access, their lack of unfettered access to other more traditional forms of the public, and they were out there like crazy, starting blogs. The content's not that important, but the form, they were much more active than Saudi men in having blogs and starting their own blogs. All that, of course, has since entered into a coevolution in which the state tries to repress things like that. But again, you see these signs that people, especially younger people, turning over, surrounded by big sisters and young aunts and kin groups that are dense with people who are not generationally divided. But you've got cousins, you've got aunts, you've got sisters, you've got brothers, and everyone is exchanging and learning from each other. You get this sort of vibrancy to these societies that manifests, among other things, in terms of technology. You can also see why some of the most interesting forms of politics in this grim era are the politics of pro and antinatalism. Some countries, and I'm sure you'll hear about this later when you talk about Turkey, which is ground zero for contradictory and conflicted messages about how many children the state thinks you should have, is really interesting. So again, we mentioned it briefly in the Iran-Iraq War. If you're in the middle of a war that requires lots of cannon fodder, there's lots of studies that have been done of, do your patriotic duty, have more babies for the fatherland so we can send them to the front. Typical traditional wartime pronatalism. Antinatalism, the campaign that's like, oh, actually, we're running out of water. Oh, actually, we cannot sustain our growth at this level, as in the Chinese one-child policy or the Iranian reproductive education policy. And right now, from what we know about Turkey, the governing AKP party had a very strong campaign in which President Erdogan urged all Turks to have 3 babies, I think it was. Go for it, yeah, do it, and tried to put in place incentives so that you would increase the sector of the population. At the same time, since Turkey is now home to about 4 million Syrian refugees, and I have a student doing a wonderful dissertation on this topic, so I speak of something that I have secondhand knowledge of. The Syrians who get to Turkey are having so many babies that the Turkish state, certainly in the interpretation of those Syrian refugees, is cracking down on reproductive services to them. It's like, and there's a lot of sinister rumors and perhaps practices going on whereby if you go in for your 3rd C-section, you may or may not come out of there with your tubes tied, for example, if you are a minority or a Syrian refugee. And there is certainly that impression that if you are the wrong type of person, how do you manage that demographic interest of the state? And of course, the obvious implication of being a young pyramid-type society is that there is lots of competition for ever scarcer resources, and that's just accelerating. And until you sort of, and I don't mean to make a value judgment or endorse any particular policy, but until you do sort of one of those 2 solutions, in scare quotes, that say Iran did or the UAE did to try and actively manage your population, that pyramid just keeps going like that. In a lawless, war-torn society, it just goes like that. And one of the scarcest resources up at the top of that, that might live up at the top of those little pinnacles on the pyramid are things like wisdom, kind of experience, the perspective of a well-lived lifetime and lots of failures and lessons learned, which is why I think every society would do well to actively cultivate that sort of resource of discursive wisdom that old people have. And I say that, of course, as someone who's getting older. I'm like, oh my God, there are fewer and fewer of us. I'm like, who actually know anything about life, and there are more and more sort of young people armed with technology and weapons and so I include among those resources for which there is competition, access to the wisdom of the elders, not to mention access to the authority and the legitimacy that those elders represent, especially in societies with their Abrahamic software that respect old people for one reason or another. So, and I think, so take that as you will. One way we can ask this question is, and I'm always going to put tradition in scare quotes because I don't want you to think that the Middle East is a particularly, is a essentially or transcendentally traditional place compared to us. I think we've dealt with that. But what is the ratio in a society? And this I get again from hanging out on Twitter. The idea that ratios are really important. What is the ratio of tradition, authority, sort of legitimacy inherited from and derived from the past, to youthful energy, playfulness, whimsicalness, crazy angst, all these things that you can think about. And again, when you think about the difference between an old society versus a young society, think of the difference between a high school and a nursing home. In a high school, you're just like, you have all these kids, all this energy, all this incredible, uncontrollable potential, supervised by, an increasingly stressed faculty, right, that struggles to keep this a meaningful relationship, versus, a nursing home where you've got lots of elderly people with lots of needs, and again, a staff that struggles to meet them. And ideally, you want a well-integrated society somewhere between that. But I think this is another interesting way, rather than to say, this is the culture, this is the religion, this is blah, blah, blah. What is the ratio in that sort of social makeup of youthful energy to perhaps slower but deeper, more meaningful, just kidding, kind of wisdom, if you will. And I don't mean this to reiterate binary distinctions between tradition and modernity. I think this is a recurring issue for all contemporary societies. Hopefully you'll hear somebody talk about media. I think I've probably used up most of our time today. But clearly an element that is new to this is media. So here's another good thing I heard on Twitter, which I think is really very interesting and highlights the weird inversion of what you expect to see and what you actually have. Somebody said this morning on Twitter that Fox News did to our parents what we were afraid video games would do to our children. And namely desensitizing them and making them part of, in my opinion, the problem. So again, just as with everything else here, you've got a very wide array of different things, from the passive mass media effect of, say, Fox News, through, and this talk about short half-lives. I mean, we wrote this edited volume on media on the eve of the Arab Spring, where these are all a bunch of very good scholars who had been looking at the blogosphere. No one had in that 2-year period the ability to assess the importance of social media. So we were looking at broadcast media, the internet writ large, with particular focus on blogging, okay? And that came out in 2014. Well, of course, and I knew this. I tried to put a little coda in that, oh my God, the next phase of this is going to be crazy. We saw it on the ground. We saw it with the use of Twitter and Facebook in the Arab Spring per se. And we also saw it very sinisterly in the ability of the authoritarian state to mobilize its resources to target and crush people in the Arab Spring. And we see the next wave of that going on right now, right here at home. So media kind of amplifies and accelerates all these different factors, I would say. And it's tempting to see it as, again, when we started doing media studies at the turn of this century, it was all like, yay, internet, democratization. People are going to overturn authoritarian regimes. And that's what the Arab Spring actually looked like at the outset. And then as the regimes, starting with, you can see where it started. First Ben Ali left. He's like, okay, I'm taking my ill-gotten gains and all my parasitical in-laws and going to France. He's out of there. The next one is Mubarak. He's like, really didn't want to leave, but he left. Or they got him, I guess. The military transformed, interestingly. By the time you get to Bashar al-Assad, he's like, let's see what happens if I stay and fight. And the result was a humanitarian disaster. It is, horrifying and shocking. So that needs to be taken into account as well. What else? The political lessons of the decade. I just wanted to show you, if I can show you here, a little video of a group that I've been working with. Can we see this? This is a demonstration by a group called Damascus Youth for Revolution from 2012. These were youth groups organizing demonstrations. The fires were to block traffic to create a disruption. It's a violent fire. And these are young groups of men and women. And this is what the Arab Spring looked like at the beginning, say in 2011 and 2012 in Syria. Just this. So these are mostly young people, young men, and you can see young women, many of whom are wearing headscarves, just very exuberant energy. And their slogans are anti-authoritarian, anti-dictatorial slogans. They're in their own environment. They felt very comfortable blocking off traffic, making their voices heard. And this is before the crackdown that is going to devastate this kind of movement. Okay, but here's the other face. So that's sort of the hopeful face. But it was all the people in those videos, I can say with a certain amount of conviction. Some of those young men are probably dead now. And anyone who isn't probably isn't in Syria anymore. And that is just the sort of the nature of that phenomenon, where you have this sort of hopeful kind of youthful energy taking on systems that are so violent, so entrenched, that it's really quite depressing. And here's the other face of the youthful Middle East. Okay, we're used to seeing this, of course, is Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. Actually, I meant to show this picture first so you wouldn't recognize him. But here he is and his other guys hobnobbing with Jeff Bezos. So again, Mohammed bin Salman is an interesting place to end our little discussion today, because on the one hand, he has come to represent a certain possibility for what millennials look like in the Middle East. Okay, yes, all right, he's the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, so in no way is he representative. But the propaganda about him is, of course, that he is young, that he is progressive in some ways, that he is seeking to shake off tradition, when in fact, of course, he is taking credit for the work of activists who have been working for many years to get their and in fact, all the women's driving activists whose life work he has co-opted and stolen are in jail now. And that's what you can do when you have the power of this authoritarian state machine behind you. So yes, the people that we see in some of these pictures are youthful, but they are also very scary. If you take that youthful energy and harness it to the destructive power or the repressive power of the authoritarian state while hobnobbing with the world's elites, but wielding this massive geopolitical power at the same time, you get the phenomenon of Mohammed bin Salman. And it's very interesting, but he is the future of the Gulf region. You can see the Gulf getting nastier, more aggressive, pursuing a truly horrific war in Yemen, and simultaneously having the sort of the behind-the-scenes clout to hobnob with Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post, even in the wake of the Khashoggi murder, to influence vetoes of arms sale ban legislation in the Congress through his good friend Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'll just sort of end this by proposing that we think of the question of youthfulness, and we haven't got time to go into radicalization or migration. The question of youthfulness in these young societies that are getting younger as a question of energy. Is that energy going to go to uphold the old, authoritarian, extractive, creepily kind of oligarchic systems of global power? And the answer right now is yes, that's the way it looks like it's going. But there's always that wild card of what it looks like when when so much of a social formation's skills, knowledge, energy, aspirations, desires is distributed among a very wide base that is getting wider and more desperate. And I leave you with the unfortunate image of the baby rattlesnake, which I started using a few years ago to describe the increasing viciousness of the worst aspects of Middle Eastern politics. That an adult rattlesnake knows how much to bite, knows how much venom to put in, and then extract itself, whereas baby rattlesnakes are more dangerous because they don't know. They're just gonna like sink their entire load of hatred and venom into you. They don't have the experience, the wisdom, the strategy, the calculations, and you get yourself what we see both in the Middle East and in the United States, increasingly radicalized, vicious baby rattlesnakes. But I'll leave you with the hopeful image of the fact that that is a small minority. Okay, thank you.